Minnesota, by the way, for game 5, a 4.5-point favorite as of this taping tonight on FanDuel. I guess I like Minnesota tonight. That was pretty passionate. And it's because I like Minnesota before the series, and here we are. Some lessons have been gathered with the way this has played out. The best player theory, which I'm telling you, coaches and GMs, most of the time, it's like, hey, we have the better guy. Our best guy's better than their best guy. And I know that I had hoped, and I think a lot of people had hoped, that the gap between Luka and Ant was closer than the way this has played out for much of the series. And Ant had a better game in game 4. I think at one point in game 4, it was 87-86, and the FanDuel live line was Dallas plus 1.5. And it's funny because as I was watching and the way these games have closed out and the gap between the closing power of Luka versus the closing power of Ant, I'm like, I feel like you kind of have to take Dallas with the way these games have gone. But maybe Minnesota was due to finally get one of these, despite having the lead in the last 5 minutes of all 3 of the previous losses. And so, look, I would have been wrong on that one. And Luka and Kyrie shooting, a big reason why we actually have a game 5. So Kyrie was 6-18, Luka was 7-21, PJ Washington was 3-13. So maybe that's all there is to this. And there's not anything that Minnesota necessarily changed or solved. Because I'll tell you, throughout game 4, even with those guys shooting as poorly as they were in Minnesota and the Cat part of it, where we finally saw him hitting some shots from deep, there's just this general feeling I have where there's just no trust left with Minnesota. And, you know, it's hard to after the 4 games. I don't know why anybody, unless you feel like they've learned their lessons and now they've aged and they've put on all this man muscle and they're ready to go to try to attempt to get this thing to even a game 6 or a game 7 and make us all share in some weird moments of like, has Minnesota figured this out in the series, or have they at least toned down their mistakes? But that's the problem, is I didn't think they toned down their mistakes at all in game 4. So Cat finally makes some shots, 9-13 overall, 4-5 on threes. He was 3-22 on threes from games 1 through 3. If you look at Minnesota's defense, which we thought was going to be one of the main reasons they could pull this series out, if you picked them, their defensive rating against Dallas was 116. And it's 4 games, but that's a really high number for who Minnesota has been defensively. Against Denver, they were a 106. They're 10 points worse defensively in this series than they were against Denver. And even they were better defensively against Phoenix at a 109 per 100 possessions. So if you look at their 116 number, that's 8 points worse than where they were leading the league at 108.4 points, which is actually 2 points better than number 2, Boston, who was, again, second defensive rating overall. So the 116 number against Dallas, if you equate it to where it'd be in the regular season, that'd be 23rd in the league. That's Portland's defense. And that's who Minnesota has been defensively against Dallas here. So even with Ants 29, 10, and 9 in game 4, I just never felt great about them because the defense isn't showing up enough. And I've watched Minnesota blow leads in the final 5 minutes of the first 3 games, whether it was Ant being tired in game 1, where he just maybe, I don't know. I just don't think he should be tired at 22 years old. I know he's chasing Kyrie. And it's funny because like the Kyrie defense and him playing point guard, which I think was another part of it, because I think they're trying to protect Conley here a little bit with his lingering injuries. But whenever we watch a game and you think, wait, isn't my favorite player, who's the best offensive player, isn't he a good defensive player? Isn't he supposed to play like the best other offensive player? Well, in the regular season, it doesn't happen a lot. You just put him on somebody easier to try to pace him, whether it's that game or over the course of an entire season. But in this case, with Ant at 22, it's like you can't do all of those things, and he just couldn't. He's standing in the corner exhausted. We talked about his paint touch attempts in the second half of game 1. He had only 1. So there's a reluctance there because of the crowds. But sometimes it's like, man, it's a star. Sometimes you're burdened with having to actually force the issue and be a little bit more selfish. Although I think his playmaking has still been pretty good. Not so much on the reads, but on the drives and then looking for somebody to kick it out to. So that's where they are defensively, which is massively disappointing. And the trust part of this, and then my easy, hard theory I always look at when I'm watching a game, I'm going to go, okay, I don't care what the score is. Okay, it's tied in the third quarter. What's been easy? What's been hard? And I'm consistently feeling like Dallas is just easier. Their time is a lot easier than Minnesota trying to figure all these things out on the fly. The trust part of it, the Ant turnovers, he's had 11 in the last 2 games. The turnover in game 2 where he throws it out of bounds, granted the spacing is bad. Gobert's right at the rim, and then he has Nas and Kyle Anderson both like on top of each other as if they're in I formation on a football field in the corner. And then Ant's late to kind of recognize it, but that's not really on the spacing. You just don't expect, and I know people talked about Conley should have been back in the game. You don't expect your best player and somebody like Ant to just throw the ball out of bounds. He had the other play in the inbounds where he lost it, where that was the inadvertent whistle in game 4. He also has a really bad habit of when he's pissed about not getting a foul, where he thinks he's supposed to get a foul every single drive. And I don't think he gets a friendly whistle throughout the regular season in comparison to other stars in the league. Cat's probably even worse with the and one demands. But then Ant will just foul somebody on the other end out of frustration on a foul that's not even really impacting the offense. It's just, I'm mad and I'm going to foul you. Or Cat will just be like, hey, I'm going to foul you because, I don't know, because I'm just going to. McDaniels is good for 2 stupid fouls, but with him, I'm actually willing to allow it a little bit more because he is constantly reaching and trying to impede the ball handler somewhat. But the problem is he's too slight and he ends up going for a ride on Luka's back every time they run that high pick and roll. And then Luka just can do whatever he wants to them because there's no real physical presence there other than his length. That leads us to the Rudy problem. All right, so this series is not on Rudy. It isn't. You know where I stand with it. Never going to like the picks and the trade and the cost and who are you bidding against and ultimately the motivating factors behind that trade. But you can make an argument that them being in the Western Conference Finals with a team that's, I don't know how young it is. Maybe it's just because we're so focused on the Ant part of it. It's not like everybody's really young. It's not like Oklahoma City young, but it's still new, right? It's playoff young, if you allow me that phrase that I just made up. But even with my concerns about Rudy and the limitations that he brings to you offensively and all that, like when I watch the series play out, and there's times where like I get a little excited to be like, ooh, Rudy's out. Like, let's see if something opens up here on offense. I just don't really think, I think you're being incredibly unfair to him if you're going to pin this series on him because it's been Cat and his shooting, and it's been Ant not really being the guy that we saw in Phoenix and in the first half of that Denver series, because that's who we all thought we were getting, and we haven't gotten that guy. So when I watched Rudy offensively, he had some big buckets in game 4. He had some nice scoring opportunities in game 2. I'd rather he not ever have 10 shot attempts in a playoff game, but that's what happened in game 2 because sometimes that's just the way the help moves on the other drives, and he's the best option. But he's only the best option with the ball when he already has decided what he's going to do once he actually catches the ball, which can be its own adventure. I know some people have been asking that he gets more lobs or whatever, and I'd be like, have you watched him play enough? Like, he's just not a great bet on the catch. And he's even a worse bet on the catch when he actually has to think about what he's going to do with the ball. If he doesn't have to think about anything, that's when you get the dunks, when literally he's enormous and he's standing right there anyway, so it shouldn't be that hard. But when he came out of the game in game 4 at the end of the third quarter, watch for this in game 5. Dallas's perimeter players ramp up. I can't wait to talk to Austin Rivers about this. Jaden Hardy was like, let's go. Kyrie attacked immediately. There's not in that stretch that I'm talking about specifically, but there's been some Luka times you're just like, okay, cool. Like, you're going to take him out. We are now. So Rudy being there is doing something that maybe doesn't show up in the numbers, although some of the numbers that I think are pro Rudy arguments, I'm like, okay, these are a little absurd because I don't think it's necessarily that kind of impact. And I think the biggest issue with Rudy over all of this is that you kind of need some kind of stretch 5 at some point. Or that's what we all want out of our 5, which is asking a lot. Like, hey, can somebody be Defensive Player of the Year and then also threaten you from 3? Like, well, that's why we're all excited about Wembanyama and what he could eventually become. But when you watch that stretch, I think it's again at the close of the third quarter, there's a completely different level of attack and aggressiveness. Like, it's a substitute teacher in. All right. And we're going to start just screwing around here. And it was effective. Although on the point differential part of it, I think it was only a point in Dallas's favor during that last stretch. So that's where the stats can go like, oh, well, they actually didn't lose anything with him being out during that stretch. It's like, yeah, but the game was being played out differently. And if everybody's on the same page and you were taking them out for 7 minutes, would it actually turn into a free-for-all? So, like, whatever you think you'd be gaining advantage-wise for having a spacing big and Rudy not being in, if you wanted to go just Nas or Cat or the both of them who can stretch offensively, is that advantage outweigh what I think would be a long-term disadvantage on some of those drives, even if it looks like they're helpless on these pick-and-roll coverages, which has way more to do with just how special Luka is at his size and the late finds that we've talked about. His pass in the second quarter, I think it was, where he goes right and skips it one-handed. Doesn't skip pass. It's a straight line pass. But I guess skip in the sense that it's going cross court on the half court setup. It was such an absurd pass right into the shooter's pocket. And that's all set up because he already kind of knew where the help was going to be. And Lucas, just sometimes you're dealing with somebody that special, and that's what Minnesota is dealing with right now. The problem overall, though, for Rudy is that, when everyone's screaming about him being Defensive Player of the Year and all NBA stuff with him, and you're like, all right, well, the weird part of this is how can somebody who's Defensive Player of the Year be somebody that Luka wants to switch into to hit the game-winning shot in game 2, right? I think people that are really into basketball understand, well, okay, it's not that simple. That's unfair to Rudy. But it is a weird talking point. You're like, wait, so the guy who's better than everybody at this part of the game is the guy Luka wants defending him? But that's just a body thing. That's a body mismatch. And in that case, for anyone as big as Rudy coming all the way out to try to defend Luka in that spot, you're just going to lose. You're going to lose, or you have to hope for a miss. Or I guess the counter argument would be get Luka to at least get off of the 3-point line and invite him to take a 2 so you're not losing the game on a made 3. And it's like, okay, I mean, a lot of this stuff is really easy to say after the fact. So that's the Rudy part of this. The biggest takeaway, though, overall through the 4 games is that Minnesota's played. I don't think they're a dumb team, but I think they've played like a dumb team. I don't think if they were just dumb, I don't think they'd even be here. All right. But there's just too many plays where you're like, what the fuck are you guys doing? On top of going against, and I thought Bill on Sunday said it really well. It's like Rivera with the Yankees. If you don't beat them through the first 7 or 8 innings, you're going to lose every game. And that's what Luka and the Kyrie moments feel like. Let's look at some of the Dallas numbers here, run through this and finish up, because as we look ahead to Dallas and Boston, where, I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but I think I'd be a little surprised the Mavs lost 4 straight as the first team to ever blow a 3-0 lead. Dallas's first game with Gafford and PJ in the lineup, February 10th. So let's look at the season in some segments here. Since February 10th, during the regular season, Dallas went 21-9. That was the 4th best record in the NBA, behind Boston, Golden State, who may say to themselves, maybe we can just run this back. Look how good we were after that point in February. And then Oklahoma City was ahead of them as well, record-wise. So February 10th on, 30 games. The offense for Dallas was 7th. The defense was 8th, and the rebounding rate was 14th. But the last 15 games, Dallas went 12-3, best record in the NBA. Their offense, though, dropped pretty dramatically during that stretch to 21st, but their defense finished up at first. And if you were looking at Dallas going, okay, that offensive number is a lot lower than I thought it would be, but that's probably not who they're going to be. But that defensive number is terrific. Are they going to keep that up? Well, they've kept up the defensive part of it, and clearly the offensive thing was just kind of a fluke to close the season. Rebounding rate, though, again, middle of the pack at 14th. If you want to just throw in the pre-All-Star break games here, 55 games, they were 32-23, 11th on offense, 19th on defense, and 28th in rebounding rate. So credit to them, trade deadline, things turned around. They improved the rebounding part of it. The playoff numbers, though, are kind of interesting. They've been the 7th best offense. They've been the 8th best defense. The rebounding rate is 6th out of 16 teams. The net rating is 5th at plus 2.9%. So do these numbers maybe tell us anything? Because there were some Denver numbers you could point to going, wait, is this telling us a story that says that this team might be more susceptible than we think? Much like the Minnesota numbers during the regular season, when we look at the clutch offense and go, okay, what do my eyes tell me? I don't like this. I don't know if this offense can get enough buckets in a close game to get through 3 rounds of the playoffs and make it to the NBA Finals. I think most of us all felt that. And yet, those numbers clearly are telling us that the eyes were not lying to us, and we see those same struggles right now. But as we look ahead to the finals and closing, you're like, shouldn't Dallas's numbers be a little bit better there? When you compare that net rating for Dallas, again, the playoff sampling of this, series can go one way or the other, but Dallas is winning the close ones against Minnesota, winning the close ones against Oklahoma City for the most part. If you compare that to Boston's net rating, which is the best in the NBA throughout the playoffs, it's almost 11. It's a plus 11, plus 10.8. So we're talking about 8 points better from Boston. So I think what we actually have learned is that it's 2 things. One is, who cares about the net rating in trying to figure out a Boston-Dallas matchup? It doesn't mean anything. Because the reality is the Clippers, even without Kawhi, are probably better than any team that Boston has beaten throughout their run through the East. And ultimately, all of these numbers that I've gone through, where you're like, wait, wouldn't that one be better? Like, the record's pretty good, but that number is kind of low. That number seems sort of average. How did that happen? But yet the record is still not only good, but in some spots great. When you look at the last 15, what was a bottom third offense, it just keeps coming back to Luka. It's the Luka lesson. It's like that great closer. It's like a team that's just like, yeah, you know what? They haven't scored a ton of runs and run differentials and all that great, but guess what? They've got like 3 guys in the bullpen that are terrific. So they're winning more of those games. And Luka's like the setup guy and the closer for Dallas.